The clock on Jessica Miller's dashboard glowed 11:47 p.m. as she turned into her neighborhood. Rows of suburban houses stood cloaked in darkness, their windows blank as if the world had turned its back on her. She slowed at her driveway, only to pause when the headlights swept over emptiness. Mark's car wasn't there. He'd left early for his business trip. For the first time in years, she was truly alone. With a weary sigh, Jessica drummed her fingers on the steering wheel. The late-night quiet settled over her, heavy and absolute. Her usual routine felt wrong tonight, the way a well-worn shoe suddenly pinches in all the wrong places. She glanced at her phone. No messages, no notifications, no distractions to pull her from the growing weight of her thoughts. The decision came impulsively. Just head to the station and take the last train. She hated night driving on the highway anyway. Besides, it was just easier to grab the red line and leave her car in the station lot. She locked her house without giving herself a moment to reconsider. Driving through the sleepy streets of suburban Chicago felt different at this hour. The streets, so familiar and unremarkable by day, now stretched like empty corridors, each corner lit by weak yellow streetlights flickering inconsistently. A thin fog began to gather, wrapping around the curbs and pulling in dips along the road. Jessica reached the station in under 10 minutes, but the sight that greeted her made her pause. The lot was empty, save for a single car parked near the edge, a beat-up sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The station itself seemed wrong. It was as if the shadows had taken over, swallowing the corners that were usually sharp and defined. She parked beneath a light that cast her shadow in sharp relief, hoping the brightness would ease her nerves. It didn't. Locking the car, she walked briskly to the platform, clutching her purse tightly against her side. Jessica had been here countless times during her years in the city, but tonight it was like stepping into an old photograph, a faded version of the familiar, the colors muted, the details blurred. The train schedule ticked overhead, and she realized she had only a few minutes before the last train arrived. She scanned the platform, not a soul in sight, not even the occasional night shift worker or the odd straggler from the nearby bars. Just her, the mist curling around the edges of the tracks and the faint buzz of the station lights. Jessica tightened her coat around her, but the cold wasn't coming from the weather. It was something else, something that made the back of her neck prickle. As she waited, her phone buzzed. A text. Sarah Johnson, her best friend. "Home yet? Call me tomorrow." Jessica typed a quick reply. "Not yet. Taking the train? Catch you later." She hit send and immediately regretted it. The thought of broadcasting her movements, even to Sarah, felt like she'd just jinxed herself. The distant rumble of the train grew louder, pulling her from her thoughts. The lights of the approaching carriages pierced the fog, brighter and sharper than she expected. She stepped closer to the edge of the platform. Her reflection stared back at her from the black void of the approaching train window, its eyes hollow and waiting. The train screeched to a halt, its metal wheels grinding against the tracks with a sound that sent a shiver down Jessica's spine. The doors hissed open, and for a moment she hesitated. The platform remained empty behind her, the silence amplifying her sense of isolation. Stepping aboard, she was greeted by a dimly lit, sterile interior. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting a cold, washed-out glow over the rows of empty seats. Jessica looked down the length of the train car, expecting at least one other passenger, but there was no one, not a single soul. "Must be later than I thought," she muttered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the hollow space. She chose a seat near the middle of the car, facing forward, and set her purse on her lap. Her fingers tapped nervously against its faux leather as she tried to rationalize her unease. It was just an empty train, hardly unusual for this time of night. She'd taken late rides before. People avoided the last train, she reasoned, preferring their own cars or catching earlier trips. Still, the quiet unsettled her. The air felt thicker, as though the train carried not just her, but something unseen, waiting just out of reach. The doors closed with a pneumatic hiss, and the train jolted forward. Jessica glanced out the window, hoping to calm herself with the familiar view of passing suburban lights. But as the train picked up speed, all she could see was her own reflection staring back at her, pale, tired, and slightly distorted by the curved glass. The outside world was just a blur of darkness. She turned her attention to her phone, a reliable distraction, but the screen showed no bars, no service. That wasn't unusual for underground segments of the route, but this stretch wasn't supposed to be underground. She frowned, holding the phone higher, hoping to catch even a flicker of signal. Nothing. The train rattled on, its rhythm uneven as though the tracks were warped. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She could hear every creak, every groan of the car as it moved, sounds she'd never noticed before on her countless rides. The flickering lights above her seemed to pulse in time with the vibrations. "Relax," she whispered, forcing a small, nervous laugh. She pulled her coat tighter and stared at the seat across from her, avoiding the unnerving window reflection. She didn't want to see herself anymore, not in this dim, distorted light. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. It was hard to tell. The train felt like it was moving slower than usual, the journey stretching unnaturally. She glanced around the car again, her eyes settling on the corners where shadows seemed deeper than they should be. For the first time, she noticed a faint smell, something metallic, like rust or old pipes. Her focus snapped forward as the overhead announcement chimed. The recorded voice declared the next stop in a distorted monotone. The name garbled, incomprehensible. Jessica frowned. That wasn't right. She knew this route by heart, and the next stop should have been clear and familiar. She stood, instinctively moving toward the door to peer into the adjoining car. She pressed her face against the glass panel, cupping her hands to block the glare. Beyond the smudged window, the next car was just as empty, its lights flickering intermittently. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, something quick, like a shadow slipping out of sight. But it could have been a trick of the failing lights. Jessica returned to her seat, her pulse quickening. She told herself she was being paranoid. It was a late train, an empty train, nothing more. But the longer she sat there, the more she felt it. A weight, a presence pressing against the edges of her perception, just out of reach. The train's pace slowed abruptly, jerking her forward. She looked out the window again, hoping to see the familiar outline of a station. Instead, she saw nothing but darkness and fog. No platform, no street lights, just endless black. The train stopped completely. The doors remained shut, and the lights overhead dimmed to a sickly yellow glow. Jessica's breath quickened. She stared at the blank window, trying to make sense of the delay. Her eyes darted back to the door she'd looked through earlier, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her from the next car. The intercom crackled. Static hissed through the speakers, followed by what sounded like faint, distorted whispers. Jessica froze. She strained to make out the words, but they were incoherent, like a conversation taking place just beyond the edge of her hearing. Then, abruptly, the static stopped. The train jolted forward again, its motion smoother now but somehow less reassuring. Jessica gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. The feeling she was no longer alone had solidified into something undeniable. She glanced at her phone again. Still no signal, and clutched it tightly, as though it could somehow protect her. The journey stretched on, the train hurtling into deeper darkness. Jessica's mind raced with explanations, but none of them fit. All she knew was that something about this train, this night, was terribly wrong. The train rattled on, its rhythm uneven, almost labored. Jessica stared at her reflection in the window, though it offered no comfort. The person looking back at her seemed off. Her expression didn't match what she thought she was projecting. Was she frowning that deeply? Were her eyes that sunken? She forced herself to look away and focus on anything else. The interior of the train car felt colder now, the air stale and metallic, as though the ventilation had stopped. The lights above her buzzed faintly, flickering at irregular intervals. Every sound seemed amplified, the groan of the wheels on the tracks, the whisper of the air brakes, and something else. A faint rustling, as though someone or something was moving just out of sight. Jessica's pulse quickened. She turned her head sharply, scanning the empty car. The rows of seats were the same as they had been moments ago, empty and perfectly still. But the rustling continued, growing louder, closer. She gripped her purse tightly and leaned forward, peering into the shadow corners of the train. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. It echoed down the length of the car, but there was no response. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and sat back in her seat. Her mind raced with rational explanations. Maybe the sound was the train itself. Old machinery could make strange noises. Or perhaps someone else had boarded at the last stop and she hadn't noticed. That was reasonable, that was normal. But nothing about this train felt normal anymore. Jessica's phone buzzed suddenly, startling her so badly she nearly dropped it. She snatched it up, relief flooding her until she saw the screen. There was no service, no messages, nothing to explain the vibration. The screen lit up briefly, displaying only the time, 12:19 a.m., and then went dark again. As she stared at the black screen, she thought she saw movement reflected in its surface. Her heart lurched, and she whipped her head around. The car was still empty, but she was certain now. Something was here with her. The train began to slow again, the screech of the brakes echoing unnaturally loud in the confined space. Jessica glanced out the window, expecting to see the lights of a station or the comforting glow of suburban streets. Instead, there was only blackness, dense and absolute, pressing against the glass like a living thing. Her reflection stared back at her, its eyes wide with fear. For a moment, it seemed to blink, out of sync with her own movements. Jessica's breathing quickened. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to steady herself. "Get it together," she muttered. "It's just your imagination." The train came to a complete stop. The silence was suffocating. Jessica glanced toward the front of the car, where the intercom speaker crackled to life again. At first, it was just static, but then came the whispers, soft, fragmented, and unsettlingly close, as if they were coming from right behind her. She spun around, her eyes scanning the empty car, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, words beginning to form but remaining just out of reach, their meaning teasing the edge of comprehension. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The train jolted forward again, the motion throwing Jessica back against her seat. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the car into darkness for several seconds before stabilizing. When the light returned, Jessica's stomach dropped. One of the seats at the far end of the car, which had been empty moments ago, was now occupied. She froze, her eyes locked on the figure seated several rows away. It was a man, or something that resembled a man. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a dark, tattered coat, and his hands rested unnaturally still on his lap. Jessica couldn't see his eyes, but she felt them on her, heavy and unblinking. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run to the next car, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure remained motionless, like a mannequin propped awkwardly in its seat. She glanced at the reflection in the window and gasped. In the glass, the figure was closer, 2 rows behind her, but when she turned her head, he hadn't moved. The train sped up, the sound of the wheels now a deafening roar. Jessica's chest heaved as panic set in. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, swiping at the screen in desperation. Still no service. The clock now read 12:27 a.m., though it felt like hours had passed. "Who are you?" she finally choked out, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the intercom crackled again. This time, a single phrase came through, distorted but unmistakable. "Next stop, the end of the line." Jessica bolted from her seat, stumbling toward the door to the next car. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the figure's presence like a weight pressing on her back. As she reached the door, she slammed her fists against it, praying it would open. It didn't. Jessica pounded on the door to the next car, her fists echoing in the hollow metal silence. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she glanced over her shoulder. The figure was still seated at the far end of the car. It hadn't moved, but the weight of its presence felt suffocating, as though the air around her was being squeezed out inch by inch. Then the train screeched to a halt, throwing her off balance. She stumbled, catching herself on the nearest pole. The lights flickered violently, plunging the car into complete darkness for several heart-stopping moments. When the lights returned, the seat where the figure had been was empty. Jessica's heart slammed against her ribs as she scanned the car, searching for any sign of him or it. But there was nothing, just rows of empty seats stretching toward the front of the train. She backed against the door, her trembling hands gripping the handle as if it would protect her. The intercom buzzed again, but this time there was no static. A low, distorted voice spoke, calm and deliberate. "This is your stop." Jessica froze, her blood running cold. The train doors hissed open behind her, revealing a platform cloaked in an eerie, bluish fog. She hesitated, peering out into the darkness. The platform was unlike any she had ever seen, desolate, crumbling with rusted metal railings and cracked tiles sprouting weeds. It looked abandoned, forgotten, a relic from another time. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. She looked back into the train, torn between staying in the unsettling car or stepping into the unknown. But the weight of the unseen presence pushed her forward. She stepped out onto the platform, clutching her purse like a shield. The train doors slid shut behind her with an ominous finality. She spun around, watching in horror as the train pulled away. Its lights vanished into the thick fog, leaving her utterly alone. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. Jessica took a shaky step forward, her heels clicking against the cracked tiles. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into shadow. There were no signs, no benches, no indication of where she was or how to leave. She reached into her purse for her phone, but it was still useless. No signal, no time, just the blank, unlit screen staring back at her. As she ventured further, she noticed something odd. The tracks were overgrown with weeds, the rails twisted and corroded. She approached one of the rusted signs hanging precariously from a beam overhead. The letters were barely legible, faded and worn, but she could make out part of it. Ridgeway Station, closed 1970. A chill ran down her spine. Ridgeway Station. The name was faintly familiar, dredged from the recesses of her memory. Then it hit her. She had read about it years ago in a local history book. Ridgeway Station had been abandoned after a tragic accident. The last train to depart from here had never reached its destination, vanishing along with its passengers and crew. The event had become urban legend, a ghost story parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far. Jessica's stomach turned. This isn't possible, she thought. Ridgeway Station was demolished decades ago. A sudden sound snapped her out of her thoughts. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on tile. She whipped around, but the platform behind her was empty. The tapping grew louder, closer, echoing off the dilapidated walls. Her heart pounded as she turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The tapping stopped. Jessica held her breath, straining to hear anything else. Then she saw it, a faint outline in the fog just beyond the edge of the platform. It was human-shaped, but its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, as if it were being dragged by unseen strings. She stumbled back, her heel catching on a crack in the tile. She didn't fall, but her heart leapt into her throat as the figure began to move toward her. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice cracking. She fumbled in her purse for something, anything to defend herself. Her fingers closed around her keys and she gripped them tightly. The figure stopped just short of the faint light from the overhead bulb. For a moment, Jessica thought it might be human. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. But then it tilted its head at an unnatural angle, the joints creaking audibly in the silence. The shadows clung to its face, obscuring it completely. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth as she realized why. The face was hers. Her own reflection stared back at her, its features twisted in a grotesque mimicry of her expression. The eyes were beady and glassy, the mouth frozen in a half-smile that didn't reach the dead, unblinking gaze. It took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring her terror. "No," Jessica whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The reflection raised a hand, mimicking her movements, but its fingers were long and skeletal, the nails blackened and sharp. Its voice came next, low and guttural, echoing as though from the depths of a cavern. "Why did you board the train, Jessica? You knew better." Jessica's breath came in ragged gasps as the reflection advanced. Its distorted face, her face, twisted further with every step, the mockery of a smile splitting unnaturally wide. The voice echoed again, clawing its way into her ears. "You've always been running, haven't you? Running from the truth, from yourself." "No!" Jessica screamed, clutching her keys like a weapon. She stumbled backward, her heels scraping against the crumbling platform edge. She glanced down, her stomach twisting. Below, the tracks were swallowed by an abyss, an endless black void where the ground should have been. The reflection's laugh was a guttural, broken sound. "The last train doesn't take you home, Jessica. It takes you where you belong." "I don't belong here," she shouted, desperation giving her voice strength. She looked around wildly for an escape. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions, the fog thickening like a living thing. The old station was a labyrinth of decay, and every step she took felt like moving deeper into a trap. The reflection tilted its head again, studying her with an eerie curiosity. Then it lunged. Jessica screamed and swung her keys wildly, but her hand passed through empty air. She stumbled, nearly falling off the platform. When she turned back, the reflection was gone. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she knew better than to trust the silence. The train whistle sounded in the distance, low and mournful, like a death knell. Jessica turned toward the tracks, her eyes scanning the impenetrable fog. There was no train in sight, but the whistle grew louder, closer. The ground beneath her began to tremble as if something massive was barreling toward her. "Run," she whispered to herself, "just run." She took off down the platform, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The rusted signs and crumbling pillars blurred past her, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. Behind her, she heard it again, the tapping of footsteps. They were faster now, closing the distance. She didn't dare look back. Ahead, the platform ended abruptly, crumbling into nothingness. Jessica skidded to a stop, her shoes sending loose tiles clattering into the void below. She turned, her chest heaving, and saw it. The reflection was back, but it wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the fog, their shapes indistinct and wavering like heat mirages. They looked human at first. Commuters in old-fashioned coats, some clutching briefcases, others wearing hats. But as they drew closer, their features became grotesque, their faces smudged and blurred, like damaged photographs. Their mouths hung open, emitting faint, garbled whispers. Jessica backed toward the edge of the platform, her arms outstretched to keep her balance. "Stay away!" she screamed. But the figures didn't stop. Their movements were slow but relentless, closing in on her like a tide. The train whistle shrieked again, deafening this time. Jessica turned her head sharply and saw the train emerging from the fog, its headlights blinding. But this train wasn't normal. It was ancient, its metal corroded and its windows shattered. Black smoke billowed from its engine, and the sound of its wheels screeching against the tracks was like a scream. The train wasn't stopping. It hurtled toward her, unstoppable, its massive form blotting out everything else. Jessica spun around, searching for a way out. The figures were too close now, their distorted hands reaching for her. She had seconds, maybe less. The ground vibrated violently beneath her feet. Think, she shouted to herself. Then she saw it, an old maintenance ladder bolted to the side of the platform. It led down into the void below. It wasn't a good option, but it was the only one she had. Without hesitating, she threw herself toward the ladder, grabbing the cold, rusted metal just as the train roared past behind her. The wind from its passage nearly knocked her loose, and she clung to the ladder with every ounce of strength she had. Above her, the platform crumbled further, the fog swirling in its wake. Jessica looked down, but the ladder didn't lead to solid ground. It stretched into the darkness, vanishing into nothing. She froze, unsure whether to climb down or stay put. The figures peered over the platform edge, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Their whispers grew louder, merging into an unsettling chorus. "You can't escape," the reflection's voice echoed from above. "This is where you belong. You boarded the train. You chose this." "No!" Jessica screamed, her voice breaking. "I didn't choose anything. This isn't real." The train's whistle sounded again, impossibly loud. Jessica clung to the ladder as the world seemed to tilt, the fog swallowing everything around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to give in to the madness. Then suddenly everything stopped. The vibration, the whispers, the wind, it all ceased as if someone had pressed mute on the entire world. Jessica opened her eyes slowly, her knuckles still white from gripping the ladder. The figures were gone. The train was gone. Even the platform above her had vanished. She hung in silence, suspended in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Jessica opened her eyes to find herself still clinging to the ladder, but something had changed. The darkness surrounding her was no longer suffocating. It was vast and empty, like staring into a void that stretched forever. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she looked down, hoping to spot the ground or anything solid beneath her. Nothing. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling and weak, barely audible over the silence. A faint hum began to rise, so subtle she almost didn't notice it. It wasn't the train, nor the eerie whispers she had heard earlier. It was something else, low and resonant, like the echo of distant machinery. The ladder beneath her hands vibrated faintly, and a faint orange glow appeared far below, pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. The glow grew stronger, casting strange, flickering shadows that danced up the ladder toward her. Jessica's grip tightened as the warmth of the light brushed her face. The glow was pulling her in, urging her to climb down. Against her better judgment, she started to descend, one rung at a time, her palms slick with sweat. Each step felt heavier, her body weighed down as though something unseen was pressing against her shoulders. The hum grew louder, resonating through her chest. She couldn't stop now, couldn't stay on the ladder forever. Whatever was down there, it was her only chance. Finally, her feet touched solid ground. The glow was blinding now, forcing her to shield her eyes with one hand as she stepped forward. The hum had become a steady roar, vibrating through the air and her very bones. As her eyes adjusted, she realized where she was, or at least what it resembled. The old Ridgeway station. But it wasn't the decrepit platform she had left behind. This version of Ridgeway Station was restored, pristine, as if frozen in time. The tiled floor was polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the amber glow of ornate chandeliers overhead. Old-fashioned benches lined the walls, and a clock hung above the platform, its hands frozen at 12:47. Jessica turned in a slow circle, her pulse quickening. Everything looked perfect, untouched by time, but there was no sign of life. The benches were empty, the ticket booth abandoned. The only sound was the hum, now softer, coming from the tracks. She approached the edge of the platform cautiously and peered down at the tracks. The glow was coming from there, a strange, pulsating light emanating from beneath the rails. The warmth of it washed over her, almost soothing, but the sight of it made her stomach churn. The rails weren't metal anymore. They seemed organic, alive, pulsating like veins under the skin of some great creature. They throbbed in time with the hum, the light spilling out in steady waves. Jessica stumbled back, her mind reeling. "This can't be real," she whispered. "This isn't happening." As she backed away, her heel caught on something. She turned sharply and gasped. A single figure stood in the middle of the platform, its back to her. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the restored station. "Hello?" Jessica called out, her voice shaky. "Who are you? Do you work here?" The man didn't respond. He remained perfectly still, his head slightly tilted, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. Jessica took a cautious step closer, the weight of the silence pressing against her chest. "Please," she begged. "I need help. I don't know where I am." The man's head turned slowly, impossibly slowly, until she could see his face. Jessica's knees nearly buckled. It was Mark, her husband. But it wasn't him. His face was pale, waxy, and his eyes were wide and empty, like glass marbles. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came out, only a faint hiss, like static. "Mark?" Jessica whispered, taking a step back. Tears blurred her vision. "This isn't real. You're not real." Mark, or whatever was pretending to be him, took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, his glassy eyes locked on hers. His mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it became a gaping void. The static grew louder, filling the space around her, drowning out the hum of the tracks. Jessica stumbled back to the edge of the platform. She turned toward the ladder, but it was gone. There was no escape. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the polished tiles cracking as the pulsating light from the tracks grew brighter, spilling out onto the platform. Jessica clenched her fists, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The void in Mark's face seemed to pull at her, dragging her closer. "No!" she screamed, digging her heels into the crumbling tiles. "This isn't how it ends!" The roar of the train returned, louder and closer than ever. She spun toward the tracks, just as the train barreled into the station, its headlights piercing through the amber glow. This train wasn't ancient or decrepit. It was sleek, modern, and blindingly bright. Its brakes screeched as it came to a halt in front of her, the doors hissing open. For a moment, Jessica froze, torn between the horror behind her and the unknown waiting in the train. Then, summoning every ounce of courage she had left, she ran for the open doors and leapt inside. The doors closed instantly behind her, sealing her in. The train lurched forward, speeding away from the glowing station and the horrors it contained. Jessica collapsed into a seat, her entire body shaking. She didn't dare look back. The train raced through the darkness, the windows offering no view, no clue as to where it was taking her. But for the first time, the oppressive weight lifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if she had escaped something unspeakable. Or had she? The train rattled forward, the steady hum of its motion filling the silence around Jessica. She sat slumped in her seat, her head resting against the cold glass of the window. Outside, there was nothing but blackness, a void so complete that it felt like staring into the edge of existence itself. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, though she didn't dare look at the screen. The device had been useless for hours, a dead weight in her grip, and yet she held onto it as if it might tether her to some shred of reality. She forced herself to breathe, in and out, slow and steady. The panic that had gripped her moments ago had dulled into exhaustion, leaving her body heavy and her mind clouded. She didn't know where the train was taking her, but the absence of immediate danger brought a fragile sense of calm. The intercom buzzed overhead, making her jump. A voice spoke, calm and professional. "Next stop, North Haven Station, arriving in 5 minutes." Jessica froze. North Haven? That was her stop, the one closest to home. Relief flooded her chest, so overwhelming that she nearly broke into tears. Maybe it was over. Maybe she had escaped. She sat up straighter, her eyes darting to the window. Still nothing but darkness. She glanced at the empty seats around her, the flickering lights overhead. Everything felt too quiet, too still, but she clung to the hope that she was finally going back to something familiar. The train slowed, the brakes screeching softly as the announcement chimed again. Now arriving, North Haven Station. Jessica stood, gripping the metal pole beside her seat to steady herself. The train rolled to a stop and the doors hissed open. She stepped cautiously onto the platform, her heels clicking against the tiles. The air was crisp and cool, the faint scent of rain hanging in the night. It looked normal. The station was quiet but not abandoned, just a typical late-night scene in suburban Chicago. A few stray cars were parked in the lot beyond the tracks, their headlights glinting faintly under the street lamps. Jessica's shoulders sagged with relief. She made her way to the stairs leading to the parking lot, her heart beginning to slow for the first time in what felt like hours. As she climbed, she pulled her phone from her purse and glanced at the screen. Full signal. She laughed softly, a sound that came out more like a swabbe, and quickly dialed Sarah's number. The call went through almost immediately. "Jessica? Jess, is that you?" Sarah's voice was groggy but concerned. "Yeah, it's me," Jessica said, her voice shaking. I'm okay. I just had a weird night. I'll tell you about it later." "Are you sure? You sound—" "I'm fine," Jessica interrupted, desperate to end the conversation. "I'll call you tomorrow." She hung up and shoved the phone back into her purse. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't even want to think about it. All she wanted was to get to her car, drive home, and bury herself under the covers. As she reached the parking lot, she spotted her car parked under a flickering street lamp. Relief washed over her again as she unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat. She started the engine, the familiar rumble soothing her frayed nerves. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The reflection of the back seat was empty, but in the dim glow of the street lamp, she could see a faint smudge on the inside of the rear window, as though someone had pressed their hand against the glass. Her blood ran cold as she reached back, her fingers trembling, and wiped at the smudge. It didn't come off. Her breath hitched, and she whipped her head around, scanning the back seat. Nothing. Just her bag, a stray coat, and a few crumpled receipts. She let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. She turned her attention back to the road and pulled out of the lot. As she drove, she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The streets were eerily empty, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long, unnatural shadows across the pavement. Her headlights illuminated her driveway at last, and she sighed in relief as she parked. She locked the car and hurried inside, double-checking the locks on the door before leaning against it. The quiet of her house felt alien, almost oppressive, but she welcomed it. She was safe now. Jessica made her way to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water with shaking hands. She downed it in one gulp, set the glass on the counter, and turned toward the hallway leading to her bedroom. Then she stopped. A single sound broke the silence, the faint, distant hum of a train whistle. Her blood turned to ice. She turned slowly toward the window, her heart pounding. The sound came again, closer this time, more distinct. She moved to the window and peered outside. Her car was gone. In its place, she saw a single pair of tracks cutting through her driveway, disappearing into the darkness beyond. And there, at the edge of her yard, a faint glow pulsed steadily, like the lights of an approaching train. The whistle screamed once more, loud and piercing, and Jessica stumbled back. Her hands clamped over her ears. She turned toward the door, but the house suddenly felt enormous, the hallway stretching endlessly before her. The faint scent of damp earth filled the air, and a low, rhythmic tapping echoed through the walls. She ran, her footsteps lost in the growing hum as the glow outside grew brighter, spilling through the windows. She reached her bedroom and slammed the door behind her, collapsing onto the bed. The hum grew deafening now, the light seeping through the cracks in the door. The last thing she saw before the light swallowed her was her reflection in the bedroom mirror, staring back with hollow, unblinking eyes and smiling.